Imagine you've been transported back in time. The year is 680 BC. You are a woman, and your polis of Eritrea is in the thick of a bloody war with Chalcis. A higher up in the military has been slain, and so your fellow women are preparing for the procession. They insist you must go with them. A huge crowd goes through the streets as the body is brought to the burial ground, and you notice some strange reactions from the crowd as you go along, particularly from the women of the crowd. They are yelling. No, more like gutturally wailing. Some women scratch into their skin with long nails, some tear at their hair in distress, some rip at their clothes and sob violently. And you can't help but notice that it seems like every woman has to be louder than the next, has to be more visibly hurt than the others. It seems performative and theatrical. It seems competitive. Today, I want to ask the question, how loud should women scream? In archaic Greece, a culture so surrounded by death, the eventual ritualization of mourning is unsurprising. Practices such as funerary songs and public lamentations began appearing in the Bronze Age, as evidenced in both epic literature and archaeological artifacts. However, in the Archaic period, it really took off and became much more widespread and institutionalized. When somebody died in archaic Greece, the mourning process was a communal affair, and the funerary rituals were split into three main stages: prothesis, the laying out of the body; the ekphora, the funeral procession; and the burial. We'll be looking at the main aspects of women's grieving process, especially the lamentations during the ekphora. Okay, so I think before we begin, we should define each of those terms. So, for the prothesis, women are intrinsically connected to the first step of the grieving process. It was those women close to the deceased, generally family members, who would prepare the body for viewing. They would wash the body and anoint it with oils, dress it up nicely, and then lay it out on a platform with flowers or other offerings to be seen by friends and relatives. And it wasn't a silent process either. The women would sing funerary songs honoring the dead and their memory, a cathartic, planned portion of the event. As an aside, I find it fascinating that the songs that they would be singing were known beforehand in some capacity. I wonder if you could liken it to how we might expect Amazing Grace or a similarly well-known song to be sung in a modern-day American funeral. In the second step of the funerary rituals, the ekphora, mourners follow the platform as it is carried to the burial site. This is the main step of the process that I'll be focusing on today. Closer relatives, again, mainly women, would follow right behind the platform. Then other friends and family and community members would join the procession on their solemn march. It was a show of solidarity and unity in the face of death, and still bears a resemblance to American funeral processions today, in which cars or people will follow the hearse to the graveyard. And I'm sure other cultures do have similar processions, but American funeral rituals are what I'm most familiar with, and therefore what I'm generally referring to as personal connections. During the ekphora, this is when ritual lamentations move past just songs and turn into a cacophony of wailing and sobbing. Songs are still sung, but more emphasis is placed on the raw, emotive cries of the female mourners. At this point, you might be wondering, why is it only the women lamenting? In both of these funerary steps, women are the primary mourners. Men take care of the more logistical aspects, such as finding the burial site, carrying the platform there, things like that. They have to remain emotionally guarded. Women, meanwhile, care for the dead intimately during the prothesis and weep for them publicly during the ekphora. I believe this ties back to their established role within the polis as homemakers. Women are generally not valued very highly beyond the children that they have. That is their contribution to society. And so they are viewed as an emotional anchor point for the family as a whole. Interestingly, in fictive works, the female characters often orchestrate the funerary rituals as well as take part in them, as a way to express authority. This flips the cultural norm where men would take the executive role. Carrie Hom discusses this in an essay on funerary rites as seen in Greek tragedy. She refers to Clytemnestra to make this point. She orchestrates the funerary rites of Agamemnon's funeral, and so completes rites traditionally assigned to males. Although it must be considered that the epic works were not set in the Archaic period, I'd venture that this is representative of men and larger society's willingness to acknowledge the strength of women when the medium is fictional, while denying real women the opportunity to exert strength in such a way. Generally, both men and women's contributions to the mourning process reflect their society's broader expectations of gender. Men are stoic, women are emotional. This theatrical level of emotion was not without reason. Okay, so remember in the intro when you were in ancient Greece and you couldn't shake that feeling that there was something slightly disingenuous and competitive going on with the women's lamenting during the ekphora? The competitive nature of women during these events was a massive part of the overall funeral rituals. In archaic Greek society, the volume and theatrics of lamentation were completely intertwined with the amount of honor and reverence the women had for the deceased. The phenomenon of turning grief into a competition, while surprising at first, makes sense considering the societal pressures placed on women at the time. With very little social mobility, being relegated basically only to the household and having their opinion walked all over by men on a constant basis, the lamentation was the one time that women could, and more importantly, were encouraged to, make their voices heard. The performance of grief also served as a way for women to assert some authority in raising their family's status. In being the loudest, women were societally considered to be showing the most respect for the dead. Therefore, by extension, their family must be honorable for having such respect. Taking an active role in the grieving process is notably one of the few ways which women had a direct impact within their broader social spheres, which is one reason why it was so central to the funerary rituals as a whole. Christian Servenu Inwood explores this in chapter 3 of her book, Reading Greek Death, where she discusses how funerary rites were used by many as a tool to elevate familial social status. Furthermore, the collective undertaking of such an exhaustive grieving process was a communal experience for women. Although competitive, it was a way for a collective of women to channel their personal feelings into a public outcry in an acceptable way. It was a sense of catharsis that women could not find anywhere else. Studies that analyze the anthropological effects of the archaic Greek funerary rites, such as Anna Caravelli-Chavez's Bridge Between Worlds, see the actions of women during these as a way to create solidarity amongst women in the polis. Specifically, Caravelli-Chavez's work describes the rituals as the bridge between personal and communal experiences, which would give women a feeling of presence and comfort within the pressures of their harsh society. Through competitive mourning, women found power, agency, societal respect, and most importantly, found a use for their voices that could not be spoken over. That is, at least, until they tried to stifle them anyway. Like many female-dominated practices, grieving rituals did not go without backlash. Critics argue that the lamentations were societally disruptive and too theatrical. The wailing, the scratching, the sobbing, they were all seen as acts of being overly emotional. Major philosophers, such as Plato and Aristotle, expressed particular unease with the rituals. In his Laws, Plato asserted that emotions were meant to be kept strictly under control and criticized women for not being able to keep to this standard, specifically stating, "We shall forbid loud mourning and lamentation outside the house." Aristotle had a less straightforward approach to the issue. In his Nicomachean Ethics, he details the virtue that is found in showing emotion in moderation, stating, "Those who do not get angry in the right manner at the right time with the right people ought to be considered foolish." While this passage only addresses the topic of anger, he makes reference to moderation extending to other emotions, and with a slight knowledge of Aristotle's general thoughts on women, I don't think it's a leap to assert that this same principle would also apply to excessive displays of grief. The two philosophers advocated for controlling and moderating emotions in the name of keeping the peace and stability of the polis. Legislative reform came as a response to the critique in the Archaic period. This was especially under Athenian lawmaker Solon. Plutarch writes in his Life of Solon that he forbade mourners tearing themselves to raise pity, but this was just the beginning of what he would do. Solon's reforms are some of the earliest known examples of laws to restrict public lamentation and included limiting public mourning. In addition to tearing at hair and ripping at clothes, Solon put restrictions on women crying or screaming loudly during the funerary rites. Limiting processions. Solon also restricted the number of people that could take part in the procession to the burial site as a way to reduce women's chance to be included in the public lamentation at all. And banning extravagance. He banned extravagance within the mourning ceremonies, as some of the more well-off families would hire professional mourners to grieve especially loudly and wildly in order to increase the familial honor and respect. In the same vein, he also banned professional mourning, in an effect to tone down the ceremonies as a whole. The results of Solon's funerary reforms on women were noticeable, to say the least. Where there was once an opportunity for independence, the reforms saw women pushed back into their traditional household roles, and men became a much more prominent focus in the funerary rituals. This minimization of one of the very few ways women had to express themselves within society further reinforced the pre-existing standard hierarchy of men and women. This cycle of a male-dominant society encroaching on female liberty in order to preserve their own comfort is nothing new. However, I think that in this case it's especially symbolic. They were quite literally inventing ways of stifling women's already ignored voices. So, how loud should women scream? In archaic Greece, women's role in competitive grieving rituals was an expression of their power, but paradoxically was also a leading factor in their furthered repression. Public lamentation was personal. It gave the women of the polis a sense of agency that they would otherwise not be able to demonstrate. There is an inherent strength in a woman's scream. The theatrics and perhaps the over-dramatization were the only way for them to be heard within society, and they were heard by the larger society. Otherwise, the response and critique would never have been as drastic as it was. There was a true discomfort from contemporary men at such a display of raw emotion. How loud should women scream? So loud that others are forced to hear.